They would later claim the regiment never mattered, that it was a footnote, a convenient detail to skip when the story of the war was told in clean uniforms and polished speeches. But on the night it began for them, nothing felt small. The air near the campfires tasted of wet earth and wood smoke, and the men huddled close not for warmth alone, but because darkness on a Civil War front line had its own kind of teeth. Sergeant Isaiah Freeman kept his eyes on the object in his hands, not because it was valuable in money, but because it was proof. A folded piece of paper, creased until its fibers felt as tired as the men around him, a muster roll with names written in ink that had bled slightly from rain and sweat. Names of men the country had not wanted to count. Names of men who had once been counted as property. Isaiah ran his thumb along the list as if touching each name might pin it to the world before someone tore it away. Thomas Hines, Elijah Carter, Samuel Reed, Benji Lowe, Tobias Grant, Caleb Jackson. Some were real. Some were misspelled by an officer who couldn't be bothered to learn the sound of a black man's name. And some were written as if the paper itself was embarrassed to hold them. Across the fire, Private Caleb Jackson stared at Isaiah's hands the way a starving man stares at bread. "They gave you the roll?" he whispered. Isaiah nodded. They gave me a copy," he said, careful with the word. Because everyone in that camp understood the danger of official. Official could be denied later. Official could be edited. Official could be burned. "Why you keep looking at it?" Caleb asked. And Isaiah didn't answer at first because the truth was too raw to say plainly. He kept looking because he had lived long enough to know how easy it was for the world to pretend you had never existed. Before the uniform, before the rifle, before anyone called him sergeant, Isaiah had been a number in a ledger. Not a name, not a story, not a man with a mother's hands and a father's voice in his memory, just a number beside a price. The war promised something else, even if it delivered it with clenched teeth. A chance to make the country write your name down where it couldn't be erased. That was the promise that drew men like Isaiah into the ranks of the United States colored troops after the doors finally cracked open in 1863. After the Emancipation Proclamation turned freedom into policy for many. After the Bureau of Colored Troops began organizing black regiments with white officers over them and regulations that still smelled of suspicion. The world likes to imagine that once the promise of enlistment existed, courage simply marched in neat formation. The truth was uglier. These men did not step into uniforms thinking the army would embrace them. Many stepped in with the knowledge that if captured, they might not be treated as prisoners of war at all. They might be executed or dragged back into slavery or punished as insurrectionists for daring to carry a rifle. Even within the Union lines, they heard the slurs murmured by men in blue who believed black soldiers were useful but not equal. They felt the weight of the pay issue too, the bitter arithmetic of a nation willing to ask a man to die for it while paying him less for the privilege. Yet still they came because the war had created a narrow crack in history, and they intended to force it open with their bodies if needed. Isaiah remembered the day he signed, the officer's pen scratching like a small animal trapped in a box. The way the officer barely looked up when Isaiah spoke his name, as if the sound did not belong in the same air as white authority. He remembered the feeling of the uniform on his shoulders the first time. Heavier than cloth, heavier than pride, because it carried the expectations of people who had never been allowed to expect anything but survival. They trained hard, harder than the men who mocked them, because every mistake would be used as proof that they didn't belong. They practiced loading and firing until their fingers bled. They learned to march under the kind of scorn that made you want to swing a fist, and the kind of discipline that made you keep your arms straight at your sides. They learned to endure. And endurance, Isaiah found, was its own battlefield. The first time they marched past a line of white soldiers, a voice called out, "Hope you can run fast when it gets loud," and laughter followed. Isaiah didn't flinch. He watched Caleb flinch just a fraction, and he leaned close enough to speak without being heard. "Let them laugh now," Isaiah murmured. "They'll be quiet later." Caleb swallowed, then nodded, as if trying to believe that quiet could be earned. But earning was complicated. Even among those who wanted black men to fight, there were those who wanted them invisible afterward. Isaiah had seen the ways history was shaped even before it became history. He watched white reporters visit camps and write stories that described black regiments as experiments, as if their lives were a question the nation was still debating. He listened to officers talk about bravery in abstract terms, then lower their voices when they mentioned circumstances that made their stomachs tighten. What Confederates did to captured black soldiers, what some Union men might allow to happen if it served politics. Papers traveled, orders got rewritten, credits for victories slid toward familiar names. He began keeping copies of things like that muster roll, not out of disobedience but out of instinct. Proof mattered. Proof was a weapon. That night, the men around the fire spoke in low tones about the next day's march. The rumor of a fortified position ahead, the whisper that their regiment had been chosen for a job other units had refused. "They sending us first," someone said, and the fire cracked, spitting sparks toward the dark. "Why?" another asked, and the question hung there with the smell of sweat and fear. Isaiah wanted to say the honest thing, because if they succeed, the army can use them. If they fail, the army can blame them. If they die, the country can forget them, but he didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he looked at the muster roll again, at the names, at the fragile ink. "Because we volunteered," he said, and it was true, and it was not the whole truth. Caleb leaned in, eyes wide. "You think they'll write it down?" he asked. "What we do?" Isaiah held up the paper so the lantern light licked across it. "They already wrote us down," he said. "The hard part is making them keep it." He folded the roll carefully, tucked it inside a small oilcloth pouch, and pressed it against his chest under the uniform as if the paper could protect his heart. Outside the camp, beyond the tents, the night carried distant sounds, wagon wheels. An officer shouted order, a mule braying like it had seen something it didn't want to remember. The men called the coming fight tomorrow as if tomorrow were an ordinary place you could step into and come back from. Isaiah knew better. Tomorrow would be a test, not just of their bodies, but of whether the nation would allow their names to remain in its mouth. And as the fire sank lower and the darkness crept closer, Sergeant Isaiah Freeman realized he was not afraid of dying the way he used to be. What scared him was something colder, dying and having it rewritten as if he and his men had never been there at all. At dawn, the camp moved with the quiet urgency of men who understood that noise wasted breath. Boots sank into damp ground, canteens knocked against belt buckles. The sky was pale and thin as old cloth, and fog clung to the low places, curling around ankles like something alive. Isaiah walked at the front of his company, not because he wanted to be first to die, but because he wanted to be first to see what was true. Somewhere ahead, they said, there was a line to break, a position to take, a road to open. Orders passed down with the simple brutality of war: move, advance, hold, don't stop. The men in Isaiah's unit carried more than rifles. They carried expectations packed tight into every step. Some were formerly enslaved men whose backs still remembered the language of the whip. Some were free black men who had lived their entire lives under laws that treated them as permanent suspects. Some were boys lying about their age because the war was the first moment they had ever felt power close enough to touch. And all of them understood that if they performed with excellence, someone would call it surprising, and if they stumbled, someone would call it proof. The march took them past charred farmhouses and fields cut with trenches, past wagon ruts filled with last night's rain, past places where the war had already passed like a disease. In one ditch, Isaiah saw a discarded shoe, leather warped and half sunk into mud. And he thought of that box of amputated limbs he'd heard described from field hospitals, of how the war didn't just kill men, it dismantled them and scattered the pieces. A white officer rode alongside the column, glancing back at the black soldiers with a mixture of calculation and discomfort. He was not cruel, not openly, but he carried the peeled-back patience of a man assigned to something he didn't fully believe in. "Keep your spacing," he called, as if spacing could protect them from bullets. Isaiah kept his men in line anyway. Discipline was armor in a world that offered them no other. As they neared the front, the air changed. The smell of wood smoke thickened. You heard the war before you saw it. Distant musket cracks like snapping twigs. Artillery thumps that rolled through the ground and made your teeth feel loose. The low roar of voices combined into something like ocean surf. A runner appeared, breathless, uniform spattered with mud. He spoke to Isaiah's captain in a rush. The captain's face tightened, and he looked over the ranks for a long moment before speaking. "They want us on the right," he said. "There's a position they need taken before the main line can move." Someone in the rear muttered. "Right," the word tasting bitter to anyone who'd ever been pushed to the side. Isaiah didn't laugh. He watched the captain's eyes. "What's on the right?" Isaiah asked quietly. The captain hesitated, then answered with the kind of honesty that sounded like resignation. "A fortified place." They tried twice. "The ditch is full of bodies." A hush ran through the company. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of men performing courage by swallowing fear. Caleb walked beside Isaiah, breathing hard. "They already tried twice?" he whispered. Isaiah nodded. "And now they try with us," he said. Caleb's hands tightened on his rifle. "Why us?" he asked again, and this time there was anger in the question, the kind of anger that could either make a man fight harder or make him break. Isaiah chose his words like he was selecting ammunition. "Because we're here," he said. "Because they think we'll do what they need done." He didn't add the rest. "Because if it goes wrong, the nation can bury the story under familiar names." The company halted behind a tree line where the ground rose slightly. Ahead, beyond open space, Isaiah could see the enemy position. A stretch of earthworks, logs stacked, dirt packed, muzzle flashes blinking like eyes. Smoke crawled above it in slow waves. Between Isaiah's men and that line there was a field torn up by shells and churned by boots. And in that field, he saw shapes that made his stomach turn. Bodies. Not just bodies, but the ragged debris of bodies. A hat without a head beneath it. An arm outstretched like it was still reaching for help. A face turned down into mud as if ashamed. Some wore blue, some wore gray. Death didn't care about uniforms, but politics did. A whispered rumor threaded through the ranks. Confederates had promised no mercy to black soldiers. Isaiah had heard such rumors before, always with enough truth in them to feel like a blade at the back of the neck. The captain moved down the line, voice low, trying to sound steady. "We take that position," he said. "We take it fast. We don't stop in the open. We do this right, the whole line moves. We do this wrong." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Isaiah looked at Caleb. Caleb's eyes were glassy with fear and something else resolved maybe, or the stubborn refusal to be used without being seen. Isaiah reached inside his jacket for the oilcloth pouch and touched it once, just once, through the fabric, the muster roll, the proof. This was why he carried it. Not because paper could stop bullets, but because paper could stop lies if it survived. The signal came. Shout. A bugle. The company rose like a single animal forced upright. For a moment the field seemed impossibly wide, the enemy line impossibly far, and then the first bullet snapped through the air and the distance collapsed. Men ran, boots pounded. Breath tore hot in throats. The world narrowed to the sound of your own heartbeat and the awareness that every step you took could be your last. Isaiah ran with his rifle high, shouting orders, hearing his own voice as if it belonged to someone else. A man to his left jerked backward as if yanked by an invisible rope, blood blooming at his shoulder. Another fell forward and didn't rise. The field was a slaughterhouse with no walls. Smoke stung Isaiah's eyes. He tasted iron. He felt the air around him move with near misses, with death passing close enough to slide its finger along his neck. As they reached the ditch before the earthworks, Isaiah saw it was already clogged with dead and wounded, and he realized the enemy's position wasn't just a barrier. It was a mouth, and the ditch was the throat where men were fed into it. "Down," he shouted, and his men dropped, some landing on bodies, some on mud, some on both. Caleb landed hard beside him, panting, eyes wild. "We can't climb that," Caleb yelled. Isaiah looked at the wall of packed dirt and logs, the muzzle flashes above it, the smoke. He thought of the stories of black soldiers being shot even after surrender, of men being hunted. He thought of the nation watching, not kindly but curiously, like a crowd at a fight. He thought of the muster roll pressed to his chest. Then the captain's voice cut through the chaos. "Up! Now! Take it!" Isaiah didn't have time to wonder if they were being used. He only had time to choose what kind of proof they would leave behind, a story of failure written by others, or a truth carved into the ground with their own hands. "Follow me," Isaiah roared, and he climbed, fingers digging into wet dirt, boots slipping, bullets cracking overhead. And as he pulled himself upward toward the enemy line, he felt the oilcloth pouch shift against his ribs, a reminder that something fragile was riding into the storm with him. Something history might kill even if the bullets missed. The moment Isaiah's head crested the earthwork, the world exploded into close-range violence where there was no time for speeches or strategy. Only the raw, intimate terror of bodies colliding at arm's length. Smoke hung in sheets. Men in gray stared back with eyes wide, not just with fear, but with hate sharpened into purpose. Isaiah fired once, the recoil punching his shoulder, then swung the rifle like a club because the next target was too close for a careful shot. A Confederate soldier lunged bayonet forward, and Isaiah sidestepped just enough that the blade tore fabric instead of flesh. Caleb scrambled up beside him, yelling something Isaiah couldn't hear over the roar, quote, and drove his bayonet into the log line like he was trying to pin the war itself in place. For a heartbeat, Isaiah believed they might do it, that the wall might break under sheer will. Then the counterfire came from the flank, a sudden hammering line that cut men down as they stood on the crest, and the air filled with the wet sounds of impact. Isaiah saw one of his Corporal Tobias Grant, a name he had traced with his thumb on the muster rolls, snap backward, arms flung wide, a hole opening at his throat. Tobias tried to speak, and only blood answered. He fell, eyes still open, and Isaiah's mind did something strange. It catalogued the death not as a tragedy but as a threat to the list. A name crossed out by bullet, and soon, Isaiah knew, maybe crossed out by ink. The fighting turned into a blur of shouts and smoke and quick, horrible decisions. A man in gray raised his hands, mouth forming the shape of "I surrender," and someone behind Isaiah shouted, "No prisoners!" Isaiah didn't see who fired, didn't see if surrender had been honest or desperate, didn't see anything clearly except the way war made mercy feel like a luxury. What he did see was how differently Confederate soldiers looked at black men in blue. The eyes weren't just hostile. They were offended, as if the presence of armed black men was a violation of nature. Isaiah heard a Confederate voice spit an insult that made Caleb flinch even as he fought, and something in Isaiah's chest turned cold. This wasn't only about territory. For many on that line, it was about keeping a certain kind of person in a certain place forever. The earthwork wavered. Some sections fell to Union pressure. Others held. Orders came, conflicting and frantic, like a man trying to steer a wagon already in a ditch. Isaiah's captain took a round to the chest and collapsed without drama, just a sudden dropping as if his strings were cut. A white lieutenant, face pale, stepped forward and shouted for the men to hold. Black soldiers looked to Isaiah anyway, because leadership is earned fast in chaos. "Hold the line," Isaiah shouted, and he meant it not as a patriotic slogan, but as a survival instruction. If they broke and ran, they would be shot in the back, and if they were captured, the rumors about no mercy would become reality. A wave of Confederates surged over a nearby section, and Isaiah saw what that meant: hands grabbing collars, bayonets stabbing downward, men being pulled off the crest and dragged behind the earthwork. He saw one black private, Samuel Reed, twist free and run a few steps before a shot dropped him. Then, and Isaiah would never forget this, he saw Samuel's body kicked hard like a man kicks a fallen animal. The message was clear: your uniform does not protect you in our eyes. They fought as if every second they stayed alive was a statement the country would later deny. At some point, the Union line behind them advanced enough that the pressure shifted, and the Confederate defenders began to pull back from this section of earthwork. Isaiah didn't cheer. He couldn't. The ground beneath his boots was slick with blood, and his men's faces were changed. He saw Caleb kneeling beside Tobias's body, hands shaking, trying to close a throat that was already beyond closing. Caleb looked up at Isaiah, eyes pleading for meaning. "We took it," Caleb said hoarsely, as if unsure the words were real. Isaiah stared at the empty space where the enemy had been seconds ago. "For now," Isaiah answered. And then a new sound rose through the smoke, screaming from somewhere behind the works, the sound of men being finished off, and Isaiah's stomach dropped. This was the other fear. Not dying, not even losing, being erased. He and a few others pushed deeper, moving cautiously, stepping over the wreckage. They found wounded men, some Union, some Confederate, some already gone. They found in a shallow depression 2 black soldiers who had been disarmed, their hands bound clumsily with rope, and the look in their eyes was the look of men who knew they were not going to be treated like prisoners. Isaiah cut the rope with his bayonet, hands working fast, and one of the freedmen grabbed Isaiah's sleeve hard. "They're killing us," he whispered. "They're not taking us." Isaiah didn't ask for details. The details lived in the tremor of the man's voice. He looked around and saw a Confederate officer shouting orders to pull back, and in that officer's gaze, briefly, Isaiah saw the calculation. Don't leave black soldiers alive behind you if you can help it. Don't allow the story of armed black men to spread if you can bury it here. By the time the smoke thinned and the battlefield quieted into the low moan of aftermath, Isaiah's company had taken the position, but the cost had carved itself into the day. Bodies lay on the earthwork like broken punctuation marks in a sentence no one would read correctly later. Isaiah's hands were sticky with blood he couldn't name. His throat burned from shouting. His ears rang. And still his mind went back to the oilcloth pouch. He reached inside his jacket and found it, miraculously intact, pressed against his chest. He pulled it out with fingers that trembled now that the immediate danger had passed. The muster roll was damp from sweat, but readable. Name still there, proof still breathing. He exhaled, the first full breath he'd taken in what felt like a lifetime. And for a moment he believed he had won something looser and stranger than a fight. The right to be remembered. Then the orders came in the calm voice of administration, the voice that always arrives after blood has soaked the ground. "We need casualty reports," a staff officer said, not unkindly, but with a hurried impatience that made the dead feel like inconvenience. Names, numbers, wounded, missing. Isaiah stepped forward with the muster roll. "I've got the list," he said. The staff officer glanced at it as if it were just paper, then frowned. "This isn't the proper form," he said. "We'll compile it from the captain's records." Isaiah felt ice slide under his ribs. "The captain is dead," Isaiah said. The staff officer's eyes flicked away, uncomfortable. "Then it will be compiled from the regiment's original paperwork," he said. Isaiah held the paper out. "This is the paperwork," he insisted. The officer hesitated, then took it with 2 fingers like it might stain him. Scanned the names quickly, expression unreadable. "We'll handle it," he said, and handed it back without really returning it, more like tossing it back with his voice. "And Sergeant," he added, "make sure your men don't wander. There are tensions." Isaiah understood those tensions too well. Stories began to circulate even as the bodies cooled. Some said white units nearby had refused to support them quickly. Some said Confederate troops had executed black soldiers who were wounded. Some said Union officers whispered that the black regiment had been reckless, that they had taken unnecessary losses. As if the losses were a personality flaw instead of a tactical reality and a deliberately brutal enemy, Isaiah watched as papers moved through hands. As reports were scribbled and rewritten, as names were abbreviated, misspelled, flattened into numbers. He watched a clerk write colored troops in a ledger column, where other regiments received full designations. He watched a white officer refer to the fight as if it had happened around them rather than because of them. He began to understand what erasure looked like in real time. It did not arrive with a match and a laugh. It arrived with bureaucracy, with impatience, with the casual decision to summarize a black man's death as an unremarkable statistic. That night, Isaiah sat near the edge of camp and unfolded the muster roll again. He added marks beside names he knew were gone. Tobias Grant, Samuel Reed, Benji Lowe, marks that felt like small graves. Caleb sat beside him, silent for a long time, then whispered, "They gonna tell it right?" Isaiah stared at the paper until the ink seemed to swim. "Not unless we force them," Isaiah said, and he realized that the battle they had just survived was only the first half. The second half would be fought against forgetting, and forgetting had a longer reach than any rifle. War creates stories the way fire creates smoke, but who controls the wind decides what the world breathes in afterward. And the black regiments of the Civil War learned that truth with a bitterness that outlived the gunfire. Isaiah's men stayed in uniform through more marshes, more skirmishes, more nights where the horizon glowed with distant burning, and always the same pattern followed them like a shadow when they fought well. Their courage was praised in vague, cautious terms. When they suffered, their suffering was treated as expected. When they died, their names dissolved faster than others in the paperwork of a nation still arguing whether they had the right to exist as equals. They endured the unequal pay for too long, endured being assigned the most grueling labor when the army needed trenches dug and roads cleared. Endured the way some white soldiers called them heroes in public and threats in private. They endured the fear that capture meant something worse than imprisonment. In certain places, that fear became reality, and the rumors that had haunted campfires hardened into documented cruelty accounts of black soldiers killed after surrender, of wounded men finished off, of uniforms treated as provocation. Isaiah carried those accounts in his head, not as political arguments but as faces. The way one man's eyes looked when he realized the rules of war did not apply to him. Through it all, Isaiah kept collecting what he could. Scraps of orders, copies of muster rolls, letters dictated by men who could not write, a torn piece of regimental flag with a bullet hole framed by darkened threads. That flag fragment became his second talisman, more powerful in some ways than the paper, because cloth carried the sweat and smoke of the fight itself. He wrapped it carefully and kept it with the oilcloth pouch, proof in 2 forms, ink and fabric, name and material. When the war began to tilt toward Union victory, when the Confederacy's spine cracked under exhaustion and attrition, Isaiah expected naively that recognition would naturally follow sacrifice. He expected that the country would look at the blood on black uniforms and admit what it had taken to preserve the Union and to strike at slavery's heart. Instead, he watched the nation begin its next battle, the battle over memory. Even before the final surrender, men were already shaping the narrative. Newspapers chose which heroism to spotlight. Politicians planned which victories to claim. Communities prepared to mourn in ways that preserved their pride rather than their truth. For black soldiers, the risk was not only being forgotten by accident but being actively minimized because their presence complicated the story many Americans preferred. A war saved by black soldiers and sailors meant a nation indebted to those it had oppressed. A war that ended slavery through black participation meant freedom was not a gift handed down by benevolent leaders alone. It was something seized, demanded, paid for with bodies. That was a harder story to tell at monument ceremonies. When the war ended, Isaiah returned to a world that still struggled to see him clearly. He returned altered not only by the missing faces on his roll, but by the knowledge that he had looked directly at the country's moral machinery, the way it could call you necessary and still deny you dignity. He found that many people wanted him to say he was proud, and he was, in a complicated way, but pride did not cover everything. Pride did not heal phantom pain in the night for men who had lost limbs. Pride did not bring back Tobias's last breath. Pride did not stop a white employer from paying a veteran half what a white veteran made. Pride did not protect black communities from violence that surged in the chaotic years after, when freedom existed on paper but danger still lived in the streets. Isaiah attended gatherings where veterans spoke of the war with the glow of nostalgia, and he listened to their stories and heard what was missing. The black regiments appeared as background, as helpers, as colored troops in a single sentence, as if they had been weather rather than actors. He began speaking up calmly at first, then more insistently. "We took that line," he would say. "We held that ground." Sometimes a man would nod, uncomfortable, and change the subject.